the kind of host for the last three topics. Now is the fourth. The first one is having to do with cities resilience. We are in graduate program for urban studies. Second one is, the first one is having to do with the MP3 Indonesian Master Plan for extension and acceleration of economic development. Second one is resilient cities. The third one is a lead from the bank, Taimur Samad and others, Nadia, and also Renata and Arlan at the time. Now we are happy to have Pak Matthew from the bank and Ibu Ririn and others. This is the fourth session. I believe probably this too technical because having to do with the kind of methodological, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm glad that how many of you? More than 20, because before is, especially everywhere, it's not in urban studies, I suppose, the participants is only 6 or probably the most is 10, 11 and so on. But we are happy to report more than 20 today. Without further ado, Pak Matthew and probably other colleagues from the bank can participate. And please don't hesitate to raise question later on. Pakai bahasa Jawa juga boleh, ada yang boleh deh. Okay. Pak Matthew speak bahasa? Oh, bisa mix gado-gado lah ya. Okay Pak, sorry for being late. The thing is traffic jams. Urban studies, urban victim of many, so many burden in the life in the city. Pak Matthew, please.
Terima kasih Pak. I prefer not to use a microphone if you can hear me at the back. Is this okay? Yeah, if it is too quiet at some stage, let me know and I'll come back to it. Also, do stop and ask questions at any stage as we go through. You don't need to save them to the end. I'm happy to discuss any particular topic as we go through it. So, welcome and thank you for all coming today. Last time we were talking to the Forum Kajian Pembangunan, we were discussing targeting of poor households. And we were sort of talking about some work that the World Bank has been doing with the government of Indonesia and also with the JPAL Poverty Action Lab at MIT University about different ways in which you could try and target poor households. For example, using community, using self-targeting and so forth. Today I want to talk about a slightly different topic, which is the targeting of the poor in an urban setting. And so what we're going to talk about today is going to be a bit of a mix of some work we've done before that some of you may have seen in our targeting report, but also mixed in with sort of an update of what the government is doing with its new targeting system, and some new work we've been doing looking primarily at different dimensions of poverty in an urban setting and how that relates to targeting. So I'm happy to report, even for those of you who are quite sick of us, that there's new stuff in here for everyone. First, let me just put targeting in an urban context, in an urban poverty context. So what we've seen is poverty has been falling in both urban and rural areas in Indonesia over the last decade, and it's been falling at a similar sort of rate. So you'll see this is the national average, except for in 2006 when there was the global food price spike. Poverty has declined over the last decade, and while urban poverty is lower, it's about maybe two-thirds of the rural rate, they've been following a similar sort of track. So there's been similar levels of poverty reduction in both areas, just starting from a low level in the urban area. Having said that, while there are more rural poor than urban poor, there's about two-thirds rural, one-third urban, this is changing. And certainly in the future, this is going to change further so that poverty is going to become increasingly an urban phenomenon in Indonesia. So if we think about the urbanization rate, or the percentage of the population who are living in cities in Indonesia, according to the 2000 census, it was just over 40%. In the 2010 census, it's basically now 50%. So nearly half of Indonesians are urban dwellers. And then based on some population projections done by Purnamasari, the UN and BPS, they're projecting that by 2025, that around nearly 70% of all Indonesians will live in an urban setting. Now that could be a city, or it could be a semi-urban city. So Indonesia is going to become more urban. And so the more people who live here, the more poor people there are going to be, even in the cities, even with poverty reduction. So what I'm looking at here is, what is the share of all the poor in Indonesia? How many of them are in the cities, and how many of them are in rural areas? So you sort of see from 96 to 2000 to 2010, you've grown to about this 35% of the poor being urban by 2010. If I take this urbanization rate of 70% and I keep the poverty reduction the same in rural and urban settings as we've seen for the last decade, then I estimate that the percentage of percentage of poor in urban areas, all the poor who are in urban areas, is going to rise to nearly 60% by 2025. So it used to be that poverty was both urban and rural, but mostly a rural issue. It's going to be in 15, 20 years' time, over half of the poor are going to be urban. So when we think about where are the urban poor and where are they going to be, obviously most of the population, or a large majority of the population, is in Java and Sumatra, and they also have the highest urbanization rates. So even though, which is the blue bar, even though the poverty rate in those areas is at around about the national average, because there are so many people there and so many of them live in the cities, what that means is this is where most of the urban poor are. So when we're talking about the urban poor, say something like 90% of them are living in Java and Sumatra. So as we have continued poverty reduction, and poverty is falling by sort of around about 1 percentage point per year, the remaining poor are going to get harder to reach. So one way of looking at this, and I'll just sort of explain this, what I've done is if you divide all the households in Indonesia up into 100 equal groups, where the first group is the poorest 1%, up to 100 being the richest 1%, I'm just showing you here the poorest 20% of Indonesians. So 1 is the poorest 1%, 2 is the next poorest 1%, and I've taken what is their average consumption as a percentage of the poverty line. So if you're at 100, that means you're right at the poverty line. The amount that you consume each month is exactly equal to the poverty line. If you're greater than 100, then you're out of poverty. Depending how much greater than 100, you might be probably far out of poverty, but you're above the poverty line. If your consumption is less than 100% of the poverty line, then you're in poverty, obviously. Now, look at sort of the shape of this curve. In 2010, 13% of Indonesia was in poverty. So that's saying 13% have their consumption is below this line. If we increase the incomes of everyone equally over time, then this blue line shifts up. And because it's a relatively straight line, then each time 1% of extra income is bringing the same number of poor Indonesians above the poverty line. But you see down the bottom, these bottom 5, 6, 7% of Indonesia, it starts sloping away from the line. So what that's saying is their incomes, their consumption, are even further and further below where the poverty line is compared to the people who've been coming out of poverty. So what I'm saying is poverty reduction is going to get harder and harder to do in Indonesia as we get down to the remaining hardcore poor. So what this is effectively saying, and this is just to sort of motivate why do I think what we're talking about today is pretty important, is if we're going to eradicate poverty and really reduce poverty in Indonesia from where we are now, we're going to have effective social programs for these remaining hardcore poor, And we're going to have to target them to make sure these people are included in the programs. And as I've said, increasingly these people are going to be living in urban areas. So poverty reduction in the future in Indonesia is going to depend on finding the poor in urban areas and making sure they get the programs and services they need to help them out of poverty. So what I'm going to talk about then today is first look at, well, how well have we done at targeting the poor in the past in Indonesia? How can we get better at targeting the poor, particularly in urban areas? Even if we get to be pretty good at finding the poor in urban areas, is this going to be enough for us to address all of the urban welfare issues that they have? So that's sort of the three main topics I want to talk about. So first of all, how well have we done in terms of targeting poverty in the past? So I think many of you will know there are a range of household targeted social assistance programs in Indonesia. So Ruskin, subsidised rice for the poor, John Kesmas, which is subsidised or a health fee waiver or a health insurance system for the poor, scholarships for the poor. There's a pilot conditional cash transfer program, which is now being expanded to be nationally. And then there's the BLT, which is an unconditional cash transfer and a temporary one, which has been used twice before in Indonesia when there have been fuel price and food price shocks. So each of these programs is targeted at poor households in Indonesia. So not everyone gets it. And so the point of targeting is to say, well, who's going to get it? How do I know who the poor are? One point I want to make, I won't get into these programs too much, but one point I want to make, and this is probably easier read on your handout, but these don't have a different design when it comes to urban versus rural households. So none of the household social assistance programs have a different design feature or targeting feature when it comes to rural poor versus urban poor. So in Indonesia, the main way in which there's different design and targeting in terms of poverty reduction strategies through the PAN-PAN program, which has obviously PAN-PAN urban and PAN-PAN rural. So when we're talking about the programs that are being targeted, they don't make a distinction between urban and rural poor. So, how well have we targeted these main programs in Indonesia in the past? So, let me show you, what I'm showing you here is who are the Indonesians who are getting these programs. And I'm just looking here at sort of the big three programs, BLT, Ruskin and John Kesmas, for 2010 or 2009 in the case of BLT, the last year of it. And again, I divided the country up into 10 groups this time. So 1 is the poorest 10%, 2 is the next poorest 10% up to 10, which is the richest 10% of Indonesia. And then of those, what proportion of each of those deciles of those groups receive these programs? Now, these three programs are targeted basically at the poorest 30% of Indonesian households. So that means groups 1, 2, and 3 should have 100% on the bars. If we're getting our targeting right, they would be at 100%. And groups 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 would be at 0% because they're outside the target group. So what you see when you look at this, if we look at the blue and at the green bars, or at the grey and less grey on your handout, which is BLT and John Kesmas, you'll see roughly about half of all of our... So when I talk about poor today, I'm going to talk about this poorest 30%, generally speaking, even though the poverty rate in Indonesia is lower. This is where these programs are targeted at. So I'll just use poor rather than saying the poorest 30 for shorthand. So about 50% of the poor are receiving the BLT and John Kesmas, which means 50% of the poor are not. Right? So we're excluding half of the poor, even though we've got programs that are trying to find exactly these people. Now, Ruskin is a little different. Ruskin's reaching about 70% of the poor, but it's also reaching pretty much everyone else in the country as well. And you look at the second richest 10% of the Indonesian families, over 20% of them are also buying Ruskin. Now, how does this happen? I'm sure many of you know when the Ruskin rice comes to the village or to the neighbourhood, often instead of giving it to the poorest households, it's shared out equally amongst households. And so the reason why everyone gets it is they share it out, and what that means is households are getting less rice. Right? So if I have 15 kilo of rice for a poor family, but I give it to 15 families, they're only going to get 1 kilo each. So the benefits of the program are a lot less. but it does reach more poor households. And then if I think about not where does what proportion of these groups are receiving it, but what share of the total benefit are they receiving? So now there's a total of 100% to divide up amongst these 100% of benefits to divide up. You'll see that, you won't see, but if you were to add all of that, it would equal 50%. So what we're saying is 50% of the poor are missing out on these programs, and 50% of all the benefits are going to the non-poor. So I think in terms of targeting in Indonesia, historically what you could say is, well, it's pro-poor. The poor are more likely to receive benefits than the non-poor, but we could also do a lot better. A lot of poor are being excluded, and a lot of that exclusion is coming at the cost of giving these benefits to richer households. Now, what about in an urban context? So it turns out that it's the targeting for the urban poor is even worse than the targeting for the rural poor. And so I think this is sort of going to motivate a lot of what we talk about today. So I'm going to look again at what we saw on that graph, which is what proportion of each of these groups of 10% of Indonesia are receiving programs, but I'm only going to look at the bottom 30%, right? These are the target households in Indonesia. So, these should all be 100 if our targeting was perfect. And what we have is urban coverage on the left and rural coverage on the right. And so you see for all three groups of poor households, the rural bar is higher than the urban bar. It's not great, it's not 100 or anything, but it means if you're rural poor, you're more likely to get a program than if you're urban poor. So the targeting is worse in urban areas. This is for the Bau tab than it is for rural poor. And you see the same pattern with John Kesmas. The rural bar is always higher for each of the different groups. And except for this first group where it's very similar, it's also the case in Ruskin. So what we're saying is urban poverty, targeting in an urban setting is having a worse performance, at least historically, than it has been in rural setting. And the reason for this is because more of the benefits are going to non-poor households, and therefore that's making more poor households be excluded. So what I want to do for the rest of this presentation is focus on two really key questions. The first is, how can we improve targeting of the urban poor? We've seen that targeting in general in Indonesia needs to be improved, but in particular it needs to be improved for the urban poor. And so there's really two main things that we need to think about. Are we visiting the right households? And when we do visit them, are we correctly assessing them as being poor or not poor? And so I'll talk a bit more about that shortly. But then the second thing, which I'm going to finish discussing, is the second question, which is, even if we get targeting of the urban poor right, is that going to be enough to address the welfare issues in an urban setting? Okay, so how might we improve targeting in an urban setting? So firstly, there's two fundamental ways in which you can improve targeting, and that's by focusing on each of the main steps. The first thing we do is we collect data, information in different ways. The targeting has many methods, but all of it's going to involve trying to assess is a household poor or not, which means somehow gathering information on them. Now, we can either go and visit every house to get this data, or which is not done I can't think of any country where 100% of the country is surveyed. Because think about it, let's say I wanted to find the poor, would I go and visit every house in Menteng to see if they're poor or not? Now, there may be a small number of poor there, but most of the time I'm going to be knocking on the door of a pretty nice house to collect information, and it's obviously not going to be the best use of time or money. So most countries in the world don't have the time or money, and so they say, okay, I'm only going to visit some households to find who the poor are or not. And so how we decide which households we visit is going to have a very big impact on whether or not we're able to find who the poor households are. Then once we visit the households, we need to decide, okay, I'm collecting information, how do I use that information to decide if they're poor or not poor? And so the other way we can improve targeting, first way to improve it is to make sure we visit the poor households in the first place, and the second way is when we do visit the poor households, we're accurately assessing them as poor and accurately assessing the non-poor poor households as not poor. So they're the two main ways we can improve targeting in Indonesia. So let's think about the first one. How have we decided which households to visit in the past? The main method for data collection in the past, this began in 2005. So 2005, you'll remember, is when there was the first, well, not the first, but there were very large increases in international fuel prices. And so the first SBA administration couldn't afford all the subsidies, and so raised fuel prices in 2005, and at the same time it introduced the BLT, the cash transfer, as compensation for the poorest 30% of households. Now, because this was being done with very high prices in a very short period of time, they implemented the targeting system in 2 or 3 months, which is much faster than is done in most countries, because there was a real urgency and a real pressure. And that meant the targeting method couldn't be the best method that it could be because there wasn't enough time. So what happened is, effectively, BPS asked the sub-village heads to nominate which households they thought were potentially poor households. And then BPS surveyed all of these households and conducted a sort of a proxy means test, and I'll discuss that in a little bit, to decide which of these people were actually poor or not. But the main thing I want to focus on here is, how do we decide which households we're going to go and visit? Well, we asked the village official in the sub-village. So what might be the weaknesses? Why might this have contributed to what we are seeing in terms of poor urban targeting? Well, the first thing, and this is not just community nominations, but any data collection method, the reason why it's so important is, if you're a poor household and I don't visit you, then it doesn't matter how well I can tell who's poor or not, you're not going to get on the lists. You know, if I visit you and I ask a lot of information, and that information I can use to score, even if my scoring system is very good, it's only the people that I visited who can enter the list. So some of the poor are missing out simply because we never visited them in the first place. And that's the same with community nominations, obviously. If the village head didn't put your name forward and you were poor, you're automatically not going to be excluded from social assistance. In addition, with the community nominations, there's a possibility that the village official could say, well, I won't give the names of the poor necessarily, but I'll give the names of my friends and family. In addition, and I think this is relevant in the urban setting, this system, which was used by BPS because they had to do this thing in a very quick time, and it was an easy way to get a list of households to survey. But it might have been even worse for urban poor and urban settings than in a rural setting. So why might that be? Urban communities are a little less well defined than rural communities. Like, it's a little harder to tell where, you know, one kelurahan stops and one kelurahan starts. And so, because of this, with the village head, even if they're not going to be corrupt, even if they're genuinely going to put forward the names that they think are the poor, they might not know all the households who are in their kelurahan. And so if they don't know of certain households, those households can't get nominated. And it's possible, even though there are sort of official boundaries for all of this, that there may be some households that don't fall under any particular kelurahan, so they don't get nominated either. The other reason why this nomination system might have been less effective in urban areas is it's going to particularly disadvantage rural urban migrants. So if you've recently come to the city, maybe the village head doesn't know who you are. And so that, they put you forward if they knew that you were poor and had just arrived, but they don't know you're here, or they haven't had time yet to work out, are you poor or not? They may know, Amri has recently come to my kelurahan, but who's this Amri guy? I don't know if he's poor or not. So because of that, the nomination system may have contributed to these poorer outcomes in urban areas. Now, so this data collection, we need to improve this data collection next step if we're going to improve the targeting. So the new national targeting system, which is being built and now used by Tampai Duakar and each of the line ministries from the programs we're talking about, is going to address this by using what we think will be a more effective way of deciding which households should we go and visit. So first of all, and I know that some of you know this, but the national targeting system, it's a unified registry. Was that the base this data to of 25 million households with over 100 million individuals. So that's over 40% of all of Indonesia is in this registry. And this registry has lots of information on who's in the household and what are the household characteristics. This registry was built based on data collected by BPS in 2011. So in the past, this 2005 data has been used to target the programs, and even if it were accurate in 2005, obviously it can get out of date. This is new data collected by BPS. BPS then worked with Tampadoka and the Council of Opera to develop some scoring models, and we'll talk a bit about what they are, that allows you to try and estimate who are the poor households or not. And then Tampadoka uses these scores to rank households and say, okay, these are the households that will get Jamkesmas, these are the households that will get Raskin and Pekaha, and so forth. So what were the methodologies when BPS and Tampadoka collected this data that is going to improve? Why do we think it will be an improvement over this sub-village head nomination system that was used in 2005? First of all, geographic targeting was used in both collecting the data for this database and for allocating out beneficiary quotas to each district. So the idea behind geographic targeting is I can say, well, look, say the poverty of the poorest 30% of Indonesia, maybe 100,000 of them live in Jakarta, 300,000 of them live in West Java. So when I'm trying to decide how many households I'm going to survey for the database, and when I decide how many households I'm going to give Jamkesmas to, I want to give less to Jakarta and more, say, to West Java, because they've got more poor people. And in the past, this wasn't really done. So there were some areas that had way more people on the list than were poor, and some areas had way less people on the list than were poor. So even if we're very good at finding out who the order of poor are, if I only visit half of them, or if I only give half of them benefits, then you'll get this exclusion of the poor. And so this geographic targeting can be done with Susanas, which obviously for each district will give you the poverty rates, and you can combine it with the census to actually go to levels below the district. So I'm not going to get into the details of how poverty mapping is done. It's a really technical exercise. But the idea is the census has information on everyone in Indonesia. And it's collected information including things like their education, their age, and certain household characteristics. Well, you can use those characteristics to work out at quite a small level, say down to the Kecamatan, even down to the Desa, how many of the people in these areas do we estimate are poor or are not poor. And so then when you're deciding which households shall I go and visit to make this list of potentially poor households, you can consult this poverty map and look at the areas where lots of the poor people are and go to those, and the areas where there aren't lots of poor people, not necessarily go to those. And so rather than sort of saying to the village head, who may choose his friends, or may be honest but may just not know who's really poor or not, and may not even know all the people who live in his area, we've gone to the census, which is everyone, and we've used the characteristics in the census to try and estimate where we should go and which households we should survey. So that's one of the big reasons why we believe the new national targeting system that Tampadoka is using, based on the BPS data, is going to be more accurate than the list that was used in the past. But the other thing is, so that's just the data collection. Now, we've gone and found, say, 40% of Indonesia, and we've gone and visited them door to door. BPS has gone and visited them door to door. Now the question is, when we visit you and ask this information, can we use that information so that we can accurately decide, are you really poor or are you not poor? So I'm going to go through some characteristics of 4 different groups of urban households. So urban households can be poor, and again I mean the poorest 30% here. Urban households can be poor or they can be not poor. They can also receive social assistance or not receive social assistance, right? So there are 4 different groups. There are truly poor households who, for example, do get BLT. There are poor households who don't get BLT. There are not poor households who do get BLT, and there are not poor households who don't get BLT. So obviously, this is good. poor households who did get the benefit, and this is good, non-poor households who didn't get the benefit. But these two are targeting mistakes. Poor people who missed out and non-poor people who got it. So in 2009, which is not using the new targeting system, this is using the old one, 8 million of the urban poor received BLT, but nearly 12 million of them didn't. And at the same time, 11 million non-poor urban households received BLT. So you can see that by going to these people missed out. So I want to look at those four groups to sort of talk about how we can estimate them. So these are these four groups again. These guys are the poor people who did get BLT. The second group, poor people who missed out. Then we've got the non-poor people who got it by mistake, and then the non-poor people who missed out. And all I've done is I've looked at the average consumption of these households in a month. So this is in thousands of rupiah per person, per household member per month. And so you'll see that the poor and who received BLT and the poor who didn't receive BLT have basically the same level of consumption, which is obviously below the poverty line. So the poverty line is about 200 in 2000. It's like 212 or something like that. So these two groups are both poor. Some of them got it, some of them didn't get it. And you'll see the two non-poor groups. Yeah, the non-poor who did get the program, they were poorer than the non-poor who didn't get the program. So that's great. But they're nearly twice as wealthy as the poor who missed out. So even if we'd surveyed these people, some of these people missed out because we didn't survey them at all. But some of them missed out because when we surveyed them, when we assessed them, we didn't assess them as poor. And so the real question is, why did we misassess them? So how was it done? As I said, in the past, in the list that was generated in the past, you go to all the households that the village head has nominated, and then you conduct this sort of a proxy means test. What is that proxy means test? Well, they asked households a number of characteristics. So, for example, what are your walls made out of? What is your floor made out of? And obviously a dirt floor is probably a sign that you're a poorer household than if you've got a non-dirt floor. Do you have access to clean drinking water or not? Do you have a toilet yourself in the house, and does it drain into a proper sanitation? Or do you have a shared toilet, or do you go to the river or to the lakes? So those are the sort of information that you collect about a household, and these are things that make you more likely to be poor or not. And that's this proxy means test that was used. Now, one of the weaknesses of what was done in 2005, and again, I'm stressing that this is because the whole exercise was done in 2 or 3 months because there's a lot of pressure from high fuel prices, was only 14 indicators were collected on each household. So that's not a lot of information to try and estimate if a household is poor or not. The other weakness of the 2005 method, which was the same list that was used in 2008, is that the scoring system for these indicators was a bit ad hoc. So let's say I've got these 14 indicators on what your education is and what your housing conditions are like, what your water and sanitation is like. I need to combine them into some sort of a way of determining if you're poor or not poor. And so coming up with some sort of a score, and if your score's too low, then we say you're poor. The scoring system used on this wasn't based on some sort of probability of being poor or some sort of estimate of consumption or income. So what's being done to improve this by BETES and by Tampere CAF, this new registry of the poor, is they've used what are considered the best practice proxy means test models that countries around the world are using. So now instead of 14 indicators, there's over 40 different household indicators. So we've greatly expanded the number of ways in which we can tell if a household is poor. Then the way in which we use those indicators to create a household score or a household ranking is, and I won't get into the technical aspects of it, but it's based on what's called a consumption regression. So in the SUSANAS, in the National Socioeconomic Survey data, you know what households' consumption is, and you also know for those households how their indicators are that you've collected. And so you can do some statistical analysis to say, look, if you've got a dirt floor, then this is how it affects your consumption. If you've got no clean drinking water, this is how it affects consumption. So by tying it into households' actual consumption, we're using this, we use more information and we're using it in a way that better estimates if you're poor or not. And so that's what Tanamino and BPS constructed and then used in the national targeting system. So what we're just sort of talking about is, okay, the two fundamental ways of improving targeting in Indonesia are to make sure we visit the right households in the first place, which now we're doing by having used this poverty mapping and geographic targeting. And the second way is when we visit them to collect the right information and use it in the right way to accurately decide if they're poor or not. And now using more information and using it in a smarter way, where hopefully what will happen is that we're better at calling the truly poor and not getting it wrong. And so that's what's being done to improve the targeting of the urban poor under the new national targeting system. I just want to spend a little bit of time though to say, this database will probably be updated in 2014. And in this time, we need to do more work to find better ways of, better indicators. So I said we're using 40 different indicators to identify who's poor or not, but we need to do more work to find new indicators, because some of the indicators that we're using might be reasons why many of the urban poor have been missing out. And so let me show you an example of that. Again, these are the same four groups we've been talking about. Urban households have been divided up into the poor ones who are getting benefits, the poor ones who are not getting benefits, the non-poor ones who do get benefits, and the non-poor ones who don't get benefits. So the three groups we're interested in here are the first three groups, right? It's the poor who get it, the poor who miss out, and the non-poor who get it by mistake. So what I want to do is, for a couple of the different indicators that we usually think are good predictors of whether you're poor or not, for example, the education of the head of the household, the urban poor who are missing out actually look more like the non-poor than they look like the urban poor who receive the benefits. And this is a problem, because that means if we use education as one of our predictors of if you're poor or not, we're going to be, some of these households we're going to get wrong. And in fact, we were getting wrong in the past. So ignore the red bar, that's literacy. The blue bars are how much education does the head of household have. So the darkest one is hasn't finished their day or didn't go to school at all. The next one is SMP, SMR, tertiary. And so if you look at this group here, these are the middle group here, or the second group is the one we're really interested in, right? These are the poor households who we've been mistargeting in the past. If you look at those, comparing to both the poor households that we're correctly identifying and the non-poor households who we were calling poor by mistake, this first blue bar is no education. So the poorest households, often their head of household won't have even finished S-Day education. And that's at around about 35%. But if you look at these poor households who we're excluding by mistake, it's less than 25%. So quite a bit lower. And then if you look at these two bars here, which are SMP and SMR, these are both higher than the poor who get included, but also the non-poor who get included. So where to use education as one of the indicators? Yes, it helps us identify some of the urban poor, but it's not a good indicator for some of these other urban poor. So let's look at some of the other indicators that we usually use in these models and see where the problems lie with urban households. So we're also looking at what type of employment does the head of household have. Are they employed at all, obviously? But we also look at what sector do you work in, because the average wages in the agricultural sector, for example, is lower than the average wages in industry or in services. Also, what type of employment is it? Is it formal? Do you have a contract? Do you have regular employment? Or is it informal? In which case, again, the average earnings are going to be lower. So if we look at the two indicators which tend to have lower earnings, which is working in agriculture and working in the formal sector, again, looking at the group we're interested in, the ones the poor households were getting wrong, fewer of them work in agriculture than the poor households who were getting it, or the non-poor households who are also getting it. and they're considerably more formal. So there's a bunch of urban households out there that have more education than other poor households, but also more education than non-poor households, and they're working in better employment. They also have better housing conditions. So here we're looking at, these are all good things. My floor's not made of dirt, I've got a brick wall, I've got a private toilet, I've got access to clean drinking water. So you want these bars to be higher. And again, if we compare the second group to the first and the third groups, it's higher on each of these bars. So these are poor households who have more education, are working in better employment, and have better housing conditions than the poor households who we do get correct, but also than this other group of non-poor households that we think are poor. In other words, these are guys who don't look poor when we're thinking it through the traditional way we have of thinking about the poor. And so, what this means is we need to find indicators. These are good indicators. They do help us find some of the poor. But we need new indicators. We need to understand this group, to understand what is it that makes them poor, or what is it that can help us identify them, so that in the future we can include them. And we need to find indicators also which are going to exclude this student. And so, for example, these are indicators we do use. These are some of the few indicators when I looked at it that have the pattern that you want, right? So the first two groups are poor. Some of them get it, some don't get benefits. And the second two groups are non-poor. And so in this one, the average, in this case, household size is similar between both groups of the poor and different from both groups of the non-poor. So this is to say poor households have larger households. In Indonesia. And so, if you have a larger household, that means you're more likely to be poor, and if we were to use that as one of our indicators, we wouldn't be making a mistake between these two groups of poor. And that's the same when we look at age. Poor households tend to be younger. They haven't had as much time to get work experience, have a higher income, save money, and so forth. So we want sort of more indicators. We need to find more indicators like this in order for us to better assess who these poor households that we're missing out on are. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is different dimensions of urban poverty. So let's say we've just done all of what I've said. We've gone and visited the right poor households in the urban settings. And we've used methods that correctly predict them, correctly decide that these people really are poor. And we get our targeting perfect, and the new national targeting system is really good. And so now we say, okay, these are the poor households. I'm going to give them jam kesmas, BLT, Ruskin, PKH, so forth. Or, if I'm targeting the non-household household level programs, but say I need to decide where I want to have a community water and sanitation program, or build a school, or build a clinic. Even if we've got this targeting of the households that have low consumption, is that going to be the right way of dealing with urban welfare issues on different dimensions? So I want to talk about some dimensions of poverty that isn't just not having enough money. You can think of different outcomes. One of them is money, right? Do I have enough income that will allow me to buy food, buy clothes, buy services, and so forth? But there are also health outcomes. My child being born safely and the mother surviving, getting immunised, not getting sick. There's education, getting a higher level of educational attainment, but also a higher quality of education. There's housing, living in housing that's safe and healthy. And there's food security, getting enough food to eat. So there's some of the different dimensions. But there's also not just outcomes, but opportunities, right? Because there's always going to be some sort of variation in terms of outcomes. But we would like it to be that all households have the same opportunities and same access to services in life. So access to healthcare, access to education, access to transportation, access to social assistance programs if you're poor. So these are different dimensions of poverty. Like, if you don't have these, you can consider yourself poor in a way, even if it's not in a monetarily poor sense. And so what I want to look at is when we think about making sure that everyone has good outcomes on each of these different dimensions, does effectively targeting the households with low consumption or low income, is that going to help us address these other areas? So how you design programs, but for our interest today, how you target these programs, depends on what are the associations between these dimensions. How was monetary income associated with educational outcomes? How is it associated with food security? How is it associated with access to schools or access to health? So let me give you one first example, which is, well, there are strong associations between these. So let's say the group in blue is all of Indonesia who has low consumption and low income. The group in red is all of Indonesia who has bad health outcomes. And the group in green are all the Indonesians who have low education. Now, here, because they overlap quite strongly, what we're saying is there's a group of hardcore poor. These Indonesians, the same people in Indonesia who are poor in each of these different dimensions. If you've got that scenario, when you go to target, the implication is, yeah, if I go and try and find these households that have low income, and I give them health services and I give them education services and I boost their income, I'm also going to be addressing those problems of low health and low education. But let's take the other scenario, which is to say there aren't strong associations between these different dimensions, and it looks something more like this. So now it's not really the same group of people who have low income who also have low health and have low education. And so from a targeting perspective, if I go to the low income households and I give them all of the assistance, for example, jam kesmas to help with their health, and scholarships to help with their schooling, or I build clinics and schools in their areas, that's not going to help me address these non-monetary dimensions of poverty in Indonesia. And so knowing which one of these it is in Indonesia, and today what we're interested in is in urban areas, that'll let us decide, even if we get very good at finding low-income households, if that's the right way to target all of our social programs. So let's think, for example, about housing conditions, and then let's think about water and sanitation. So first of all, I'm looking at this group of urban households in Indonesia who are poor, that is in the poorest 30% of the country, which is about 22% of all urban households. So this blue, when you look at each of these diagrams, they're proportional. So if it looks bigger, it represents more people. And so 22% of urban households are poor. Let's think about substandard housing. So this is saying they haven't got a good floor, they haven't got good walls, and so forth. That's actually 52% of urban households in Indonesia. And so this is more than the ones who are poor, but the question is, how do these guys compare? All of those poor, do all of the poor have bad housing conditions, or is it a separate group? And so what we see is, yeah, actually it is a pretty good overlap. Almost all of the poor are the same people, are amongst the much larger subset of urban households who don't have good housing conditions. So if you went and targeted poor households with some sort of a housing improvement program, for example, that might be a good way of going. Or if you just boost the incomes of poor households, that may also help with living conditions. What about if we think about water and sanitation? Again, this is bigger, but it'll be proportional to the other circles I showed you. These are all the poor households in Indonesia. In urban settings, it's about the same size, 24%, as the poor urban households. So it's the urban households who don't have clean water and don't have proper sanitation. Are they the same households? Now, in this case, not so much, right? Less than, if we think of this group here, well less than half of the people who don't have clean water and don't have good sanitation in Indonesia are also, in urban Indonesia, are also the poor of urban Indonesia. So if I've got something that's trying to address water and sanitation, and I go and target it at the urban poor by thinking about the ones who have low income, I'm going to be missing out a lot of the people who are actually the ones who need that type of a program. And so sort of the implication here, all I'm raising here are questions. The previous part of it was problems and then solutions that we've implemented in Indonesia. Now I'm raising questions that we need to find answers to think more about addressing these issues of urban welfare. And so, the real implication here is, why is it that these non-poor households don't have good access to water and sanitation? Right? Because it's obviously not necessarily an income issue. It's not that they can't afford to buy those services. So we need to find that out. We need to do more analysis. It could be that when you're targeting programs at this, you need to be thinking at the community level. Right? It probably, if there's not clean water in general in the community, it doesn't matter if you're poor or not, no one's going to have it. And the same with good sanitation. That may be the answer, it may not, but that's the sort of thing we need to find out. What about if we think about access to services, access to education, access to education, access to health, and access to transport? So here I'm talking about physical, not financial barriers. Is there a clinic that is nearby you within a certain reasonable distance? Is there a school that's nearby you within a certain reasonable distance? Do you have reasonable transport access in terms of going into, say, the Kanto Kecamatan or something like that to do business? Now, the data from this, most of the data I'm showing you is from Susanas, so it's at the household level. These things here are going to be looking at portions of households, but the information is coming from PODES, the village census. So 3 times every 10 years, BKS goes out to all the villages, now 80,000 or something, village Kelurahan and Desa, and does a big survey of, do you have a school, do you have a road, do you have a health centre, a Puskesmas or Posyandu. And then, based on that, what we've been doing at the World Bank is constructing a measure of whether or not you have access, a measure of your degree of access to health, to education, and to transportation. And how these are done is technical, I won't get into it, but we've sort of said people who have the lowest score on each of these are living in an area where they don't have good access to health, good access to schools, good access to transport. So in rural households, are these the same households or are they different households? And so what we see is strong overlap. It's like scenario 1 that I was talking about. So in rural areas, the people who don't have don't have a health clinic nearby, or don't have a school nearby, or don't have good transportation, are all living in the same place. Right? They're all the same poor in terms of access to these services. And so from a rural perspective, you can focus on these different locations and you can really try and build their infrastructure on all 3 aspects. But what about for urban households? Nothing like an overlap, right? It's really quite different. So the people who are near Puskesmas, for example, are not necessarily the same people who are not near schools, and are not necessarily the same people who don't have good transportation services. So the urban setting is very, very different than the rural setting. And so when we're thinking, and this one time I'm not bringing it back to consumption, but it does say, look, when I'm thinking about how do I provide social service, provide these important services to the urban poor of Indonesia or to all urban households, then I can't just go to the same areas as I can in the rural locations. Where I go to school is not necessarily where I want to be building a health centre. What about food security? Am I getting enough to eat? Okay, so I've taken the urban poor, and here I haven't looked at those who are in the bottom 30 of the country. I've looked at those who are beneath the official poverty line. So that's about 7% of urban households. And the reason why I've used the official poverty line here is, as some of you will know, the official poverty line, most of it is made up by, do you get enough food to eat? So about 80% of the poverty line is set by saying, do you get, what are the prices of food that would be enough for everyone in the house to have 2,100 calories per day, right? Are you getting enough food? And then 20% of the poverty line is non-food essentials like education, health, housing, clothing. But basically the people who are poor don't have enough money to eat, to get enough food. So when we think about who are the food insecure, and there are different definitions of food insecure. Here I just mean who's not eating enough. And I'm looking here at a definition based on light activity. So we can go into the Susanas and we can see what food did you consume, what calories were there, but also what food do you need. So children need different food than adults, women and men of different ages need different food. So we looked at the characteristics of the household and we said, how much food does this household need to be consuming? And if you weren't getting enough, we've called you food poor. Here we're just looking at enough food for light activity, not for like heavy work in the fields or anything like that, just light activity. Now, it's 7%, about the same as the urban poor. And so you would think these would be the same two groups, right? The people who aren't getting enough food are the same people who don't have enough money to get enough food. But actually what we see is, again, it's well less than a half overlap. So what does this mean? There's a lot of people who aren't getting enough food, but they do have enough money to buy it. Now, the urban ones, when you do this at a national level, it makes slightly more sense, and I'll speak to one of the difference in methodology is you would think, well, hang on, these guys, if we're saying they don't have enough money to get enough food, how are they getting enough food? Because they're not in this area. Now, it could be that we're not measuring it properly, but there's also a slight difference in methodology. And this one here, we constructed it based on if you've got men, women, what age, children, and so forth. Whereas the official poverty line just says 2,100 calories for everyone, so it treats children the same as adults. So there could be a slight difference in methodology here. But the key thing is looking at that, it's saying there are people who have enough money to get food, but they're not. Now, why would this be, is a question that we would want to find out. But if we were targeting food insecurity, giving people income is appearing to be not enough. Now, is it because the poor think there are other things that are as important or more important than food? And so, Duflo Banerjee tells stories of having gone into a poor household in India, and they look at it, and he's got a TV, and he's got some appliances, and they say, but he says he hasn't get enough to eat, and they say, well, why is this? He says, well, TV's more important than food. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily the same case in Indonesia, but it could be that the poor are choosing to use their money, that these households who have enough to get enough food are spending it on other things. Or there could be something else. We need to know that. When we think about, are you getting enough food to be doing a moderate amount of activity, so like working out in the fields, even fewer, lots of those are also not poor households. What about in relation to Ruskin? So here I've taken, the poorest 30%, and I've taken the people who aren't getting enough food for moderate activities. Again, you can see that the overlap's not very good. So there's a lot of households who could be eating enough for moderate activity that are not. And I look at who's not getting Ruskin, right? And so it's not because you're missing out on Ruskin either that you're not getting enough. Now, as I said before, Ruskin a lot of the times just gets shared out in the village, and it gets shared out by a lot more people than it was intended to help. And so you may get Ruskin, but if you're getting 1 kilo, 2 kilo, 3 kilo of rice a month, that's not going to help you very much be not food poor. So it may not just because of the targeting, it could be because of the program's not getting enough rice to the poor household. But so this is sort of saying, if you think about food security, targeting the poor households is not necessarily going to be targeting the same people as we're trying to reach. So we need to understand why this is. Now, one of the reasons could be, and we did this work with an intern that we had out from Princeton University and was working on this with us, and she was very shocked and horrified when she looked at the poverty basket of Indonesia, and the component in the food basket that has got the second highest value after rice, of course, is tobacco, which of course provides 0 calories. So that could also be one of the reasons why poor households are not in it. I don't know, I'm just relating that because she loved to tell that story because she couldn't believe that tobacco, she could believe, it's a preference thing and maybe you include it in the non-food, but she was a little shocked to see it as the second most important food component of the basket. Okay, and so finally, what about school enrollment in urban areas? So we've looked at just urban households that have children aged 13 to 15. So these are kids who should be in SMK, right? But 30% of households who have these children, they're not actually enrolled in SMK. Now, why is this? Well, sorry, that figure there of 28.8 is wrong. It should be 22 like in the previous chart. If we take about the poorest 30, if we take the poor in urban areas again and we say, is this bubble going to come up? It's sort of massively overlapping this bubble, and they may be not enrolled in school because they're poor. Not really. Nearly 3/4 of them who are not enrolled are not in particularly poor households. Well, is it because there's no SMK school close by to them? Here we chose within 1 kilometre of where they live. And no, it's not really that either. So you've got this puzzle that says, 30% of urban households whose kids should be in SMP are not in SMP. And it's not really because they're amongst the poorest of urban households, and it's not really because they don't live particularly nearby by a school. Of course, in urban areas, this is quite small, but in urban areas, there are a lot more people that are close to school. Well, one of the reasons that we considered was parents' education. So it's well known that if your parents have lower education, they may value education for their children less. But if we look at who these groups are in the urban areas, it's also not explaining very much of this under-enrollment problem in urban areas. So I don't have the answer for you. I can't tell you who are these people and why are their kids going to school. We've looked at a few things. For example, the relative financial costs of schools where you live. They could be, even though you're not particularly poor in terms of income, it just may be that schooling is very expensive where you are relative to other locations. That explains some, but not a lot. It also could be, well, why don't people send their kids to school? Well, it's because they want them to go and work and earn money to bring into the household. And even if you're not particularly poor, a lot of Indonesians are still pretty poor, even if you're not at the bottom 30. So you may want your kid to go out and earn more money. And so we looked at the relative opportunity costs, or the wages that 13 to 15-year-olds can earn in different places in Indonesia, and that didn't really explain too much of this missing thing as well. So I don't really have, in fact, we added some of these bubbles after people said, well, what about this, what about this? And so we had a look and it doesn't explain it. So there is a question here that says, what is driving this under-enrollment? Because it doesn't appear to be access, and it doesn't appear to be access, education, or poverty. And so, again, from a targeting perspective, if I was trying to give, say, scholarships, BSM, if I was targeting this to the poorest 30% of Indonesians, it's not necessarily helping these people who aren't enrolled. And so where I'm sort of going on this last section is to say, look, there have been problems with finding the low-income households in Indonesia in the past, but a lot of the work that's been done by BPS and by TPDOK is really improving the system. So I think in the future we're going to be a lot better at finding low-income households in Indonesia. But what I am saying is, when you think about targeting all social services and social assistance to these households, it may not necessarily address all of the welfare issues, particularly in urban areas, that you might be wanting to do with it. So we do need to think about what is the targeting system for a particular program and its particular objective. So just sort of in summary, where we are is poverty is going to become increasingly an urban phenomenon as more and more people are living in the cities in Indonesia. There are all these programs that exist to help the poor. In the past, we haven't been getting it to those people. Well, half of them we haven't been getting it to. So we do need to improve that targeting. But the new unified registry, the new national targeting system is going to go a long way towards reducing the number of poor who are missing out from these programs. So we're definitely on the right track to improving targeting. But there's more work that's required. As you saw, there's a group of urban poor who have but relatively higher education, seem to work in relatively better jobs and seem to work in relatively better living conditions, who are poor and being excluded from these programs. So we need to find better indicators to help us not make a mistake with them. We also need to test new methods for assessing the poor. So this is sort of coming back to the last time we spoke about the different experiments that have been done. So working with the community to identify poor households that have been missed out by these statistical methods. Or having households apply to sort of say, I've missed out and I need to be assessed. The other thing about the Unified Registry is, let's say the list that we collected, the data we collected in 2011 is pretty accurate. Things change. Over half of the poor in Indonesia this year won't have been poor last year. Right? Poverty in Indonesia is very, very fluid. People move in and out quite a lot. And so maybe you lose your job, or you have a health shock, or your husband dies, for example. Then in 2011, when I visited you, you look fine. Your house is okay, and you've got a job, and you've got decent education. But suddenly you become poor. So unless this registry stays up to date over time, this list, which could be accurate to begin with, will become less accurate over time. So to deal with that, we need to have a good appeals system. Say, look, I think you got it wrong. You're saying I'm not poor, but I am. And have some method of dealing with that, but also some systematic way of updating. People can say my circumstances have changed. I'd like to apply to be part of these programs. And finally, we need to think, and this is based on what we've just seen with those Venn diagrams, we need to think about, do we need different targeting instruments for different programs? Do we want to target low-income households for every program? Or do we want to say in some of these programs, actually it's not necessarily the low-income people who are poor on some of these other dimensions? And so should we be targeting some of these programs, for example, food security or food awareness programs about the right sort of foods to eat, to different types of households? And how will we identify who they are? And so there's a lot more work, I think, that needs to be done to understand poverty in Indonesia and the characteristics of poverty and the constraints of poverty, but especially in urban areas, for sort of three really key reasons. One, the urban poor are going to become the majority of the poor. Two, the urban poor, the ones that we target, poorer than the rural poor. And three, the urban poor are the ones that are the most different on these different dimensions, and the ones that we understand least about what's going on here. Poverty, historically was more of a rural issue, not necessarily. You think about England and the Industrial Revolution, there's certainly plenty of urban poverty, but a lot of the 20th century poverty reduction focuses are focused on rural types of concepts, and at least the study of it has been quite rural. And there is this definite need for us to better understand urban poverty for those reasons. So that's the talk, and I'm happy to take questions and for us all to discuss these issues.
Thank you very much, Pak Matthew. What I can say is, wow. Not as easy and simple as I thought, actually. Urban targeting is more difficult than urban area. And staggering is urban poor becoming the future of Indonesia. Higher and higher people is going to city and then into poor condition. Let me invite the floor. I'm glad to see you enjoyed the talk of Pak Matthew and so many deep analysis of targeting issues in urban area. Silahkan, please. One, Pak John and others. Mas Mas? Oh, lupa. Sering ketemu di televisi. Pak Ihsan ya, dan Pak John. Who else from here? The third row atau the third column here? Mbak atau Ibu? Mbak siapa Mbak? TV. Oke. Satu lagi sebelah kanan. Pakai bahasa Indonesia nggak apa-apa. Nanti biar ada Mbak Ririn di sini. Tiga dulu ya. Pak John, oke. Silakan sebutkan nama dan institution. You are associated with.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm John from Enrollment Studies. I think we don't need this. My voice is quite loud. Never mind. So I'm John Krisang from Enrollment Studies University of Indonesia. Thank you for the chance. Please also need to inform that temporarily I'm still working also in the UN agency, so I'm quite familiar with this work of talking about poverty reduction. But give me the chance for three questions, no problem, right? Okay, number one is it's a simple question to me about your statement here about poverty targeting, especially in urban area, right? So we limit it to urban area. We saw in this year we're talking about the MDGs, Millennium Development Goals. Number one, of course, this is the target, but we didn't see the very exact point, the target point, because the MDGs, we talk about the number one is eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. So when we mix it up all about the poor standard, I I think we are a little bit positive. I mean, if I may say that. Positive means this is number one, talking about the standard, the scope of work that we need to be engaged. This is number one. And then number two, talking about the example, one of the implementation that we need to take into account, this is like direct cash transfer or BLT. What you say in English, maybe in the field we call it direct cash transfer like that. This is pros, contras. I mean, I as a student, I didn't agree with this because rather than give the fees to the people, it's much better to give the fishing gear and show them how to use it. I mean, this is still pro contras even in the pattern rules because, as you say, maybe approximately 50% goes to unnecessary people. The target is not there. So why we must post the money? Why don't we use this money to open the job for the people who need the jobs? Because I think 92% of the reasons of the poverty here in our country now is because we didn't know the job, or in addition to that is the skill to do the job. I mean the skill level. Some people is general worker or we need to elevate their skill. So this money, I mean, why don't we start thinking outside the box? Why you must do this? Sorry to say, this is the way of the bankers thinking. I don't know either what it's such thinking. Sorry to say that. This is number two. Number three, as you may know, I mean, you explain all of this assessment. How do you classify the poor? I think in the urban areas, let's ease our life. I mean, our life is already complicated. Why don't we make it easy? We can have a comprehensive, like integrated, you know, so many programs, right? Well, we have a program, UN have a program, US, Australia have a program, and the government also have a program. Why don't we agree on one mapping? I mean, urban is now we are in the high technology here. We have social net, we have Facebook, we have Twitter. I mean, to do assessment is not quite like 10 years ago. So we need to modify the way we do assessment. Despite all of these institutions in government, we have neighborhood, RT, we have Kelurahan. What they do? I mean, for the assessment, so many hands. So the craft is there, the tools is there. Only we need to simplify, I guess, all of this questionnaire, whatever you make a platform to check out with that. Because actually we have the BPS, right? I mean, 2010, I think we have the base data. If you are hesitant without the result, we can do every check and cross-check again. So, thank you for the chance. Hopefully that at least we can share each other what's the real situation. Thank you.
Okay, so 3 questions. So on the Millennium Development Goal, the first one, that's right, extreme poverty and hunger. Well, the first thing that we just saw is extreme poverty and hunger might not necessarily be the same thing in Indonesia, and I think this is, at least it's been new for me to think about. We'd always thought about it as being the same goal. I mean, we'll wait till 2015, but at this stage on poverty, for extreme poverty, you know, Indonesia will have to have decent performance in poverty reduction over the next 3 years if it's going to meet its target. I think the target's about 7.5%, is it? And so it can be done, but what we're effectively saying is poverty reduction in Indonesia, it's been falling over the last 10 years since the recovery from the crisis. It's great, we've had good economic growth, we've had poverty reduction, but it isn't falling as fast as we'd like.
We can't try to concept now, right? Because the world knows that Indonesia is already in the million country. Now we start contradicting our statement despite all of these.
Right, and so I think what this means is we need to be thinking a bit about how we can have poverty reduction be faster. Do we have the right programs? Are there the right programs, the right design, the right implementation to help? But also, this is a big thing about targeting. Even if we've got the right programs, when 50% of the poor are missing out on them, that's not helping us achieve our targets. So targeting has been a big part of that. But I want to get on to the other two topics, which I think are perhaps more interesting. On the BLT, in terms of, Ikan and Kaya. First of all, when I was putting up the different data up here, and sometimes I would use BLT, it was just as an example. You see exactly the same patterns with the other programs like Jump Kesmas and with Ruskin and things like that. So don't think that it's just a BLT specific issue. But think of BLT as being part of the tools with which you're going to find poverty. Now, I agree completely with you that the way you get people out of poverty is not just people giving them money. The way people get out of poverty is to bring themselves out of poverty through earning more income. And so we need long-term, I agree with you completely, we need to be generating jobs, and not just any jobs, but good quality jobs. Ones that pay well and are rewarding, and things like that. So employment generation and good employment generation is a key part. It's one half of the two long-term poverty reduction strategies. The other related to that better employment is also long-term human capital development. So even if there are good jobs, we need the kids today to be healthy and well educated to do those good jobs. And so a lot of the programs, PKH, for example, Jump Kesmas, BSM, and even the sort of the SJSN framework, for example. This is all oriented at human capital development and protection. And so it's not that Indonesia's poverty reduction strategy is just give them cash. There's a long range of those. So that's one part of it. Create good jobs for people to earn enough not to be in poverty, and give them good health and education so they can do those jobs. The second part of poverty reduction, though, is that's what we call promoting people out of poverty. The second part is protection. Let's say I'm outside of poverty, but I have an accident. I lose my job, or I get an accident or something. I can fall below the line of poverty. So the other way that, and this is what I was saying, over half of the poor each year are new poor. They weren't poor before. So imagine if none of them came below, we would have halved poverty in Indonesia in a year. So having a safety net that stops vulnerable people from falling below poverty is a key part of that. Now that safety net, something like Jump Kesmas is good. It allows you to go to hospital if there's a problem and you're poor and to pay for it. And we need to look maybe things about public works, some sort of employment guarantee scheme for if you lose your job. In that, I'm getting around to BLT. In the context of that, think of BLT as just being one of the elements of the safety net. BLT is not a permanent program. In 2005, it ran for 12 months. In 2008, it ran for 9 months. Right? And when it was being considered running again this year, if fuel prices had gone up again, it would have been for 6 months. So it's a temporary program. And it doesn't give you enough money to become dependent. The amount you get is worth about 10 or 15% of the poverty line. So that's not enough to, one, bring people out of poverty. There's no reason to stop working or anything like that. But what it does do is, let's say I've got a kid in PKH, or they've got scholarship under BSM and they're in school. And let's say his father loses his job. In the case of LT, it's used when prices go really high. So let's say fuel prices go really high, rice prices go very high, and they go, right, I'm going to take the kid out of school so he can go and work because we can't afford food at the moment. Well, if we could just give them a bit of cash to help them temporarily afford the food while prices are high, and then when they come back down to stop it, all of this long-term development we're doing to get people out of poverty is protected by the program. So I completely agree that what you want to do is give them a kaya in the long run. But, that's not much good to you on a really, really bad day and you need income. So think of the BLT in that framework. We would never advocate it as a long-term poverty reduction strategy just by giving cash. But it can be a useful tool to protect from short-term shocks. The integration of poverty assessments and poverty programs, I think this is a really interesting question. Firstly, the poverty programs and then the poverty assessments. There's a bunch of different programs, and some of them are run by the government, some of them are run by NGOs and so forth. And how integrated are they? How integrated is Jump Kesmas and Ruskin and BSM and so forth? And work that we've done, even though they're meant to go to the same people, less than 1/3 or 1/3 of poor households get all three programs, even though they're meant to get all three programs. and yet aren't they meant to be targeted at the same group of people? What we've seen, particularly in South America, is integration of these programs into one structure, and particularly in Chile and Colombia and so forth, often through the use of a social worker who sort of says, you're a poor family, and I know you're on jump Kesmas, but you're not getting scholarships, let me put you in touch with this program. So then you also need to be thinking, are these programs working together or fighting against each other? But I think your point is more about how do we do better assessment of the poor in the first place. So we've been looking a little bit at this. So they're the targeting experiments that I spoke about. The community has knowledge that BPS isn't getting when they go and survey the households. Poor households themselves know their status better than the person who's coming from bad hair. So we've been doing some pilots of how you can use that type of information. But the really interesting stuff is when you mentioned Twitter and things like that, is there's a lot of information in the world now, a lot more information than there used to be. How can we tap into all that sort of information, like not cell phone records, but like who owns cell phones and how much they're using them, or like car ownership records, or even internet records type of thing. And so there's a lot of new approaches being done in the world, and we've had a little bit of a look at it here in Indonesia. About new approaches and new data. And so, one, I think, exciting thing in that respect that's starting on, we launched on Monday, is the UN has their Global Pulse initiative. And so this is a new thing they're trying, and Indonesia will be the first country in Asia to have a specific lab. And they're going to have sort of real experts in these data types of things to say, they're going to be using it to identify when is there a shock coming to households. So, for example, the classic example is if you monitor the internet search for influenza or for the flu, if you just monitor how many times that is searched in a country, it will predict, by about an extra 2 weeks or an extra month if there's going to be a flu epidemic in the country. So there's a lot of things we can do with so much more information. We just need to learn how. And I think that this initiative that's going to be launched on Monday is the first step towards it. But there's a lot, I agree, we need to get a lot smarter about how we use these data.
Thank you, Matthew. My name is Iksan. I'm just had one question when I come here. It's actually just very quickly, because I've been listening to your first part of your speech. I mean, at the moment, the budget for poverty is actually increasing every year. I mean, from what I know, for 2012, the government has allocated around more than 100 billion. 100 billion? Yes. Rupiah. To alleviate poverty. But at the same time, you look at the BPS data from 2010, 2011, 2012, the amount of people who actually alleviated from the poverty is getting reduced. It's declining. I would like to know from you what's actually the best possible answer for that. I mean, in terms of why the budget is increasing, but at the same time, the number of poor people. Right. This is a political reason. We have no answer to this.
And these are the right questions.
That's the first one, right? Second one, I mean, in terms of the strategy or the targeting that you guys in World Bank has developed over here, how does this actually relate to the programs that the government currently implemented, and when it's actually going to be carried out in the field, because this issue is going to be getting more sexy. Close to the elections, and it's actually, as you say, 67% are poor people living in the illegal area. So that's my question. Thank you.
Right. Yeah. First, not yet 2/3. But in the future, it's going to become more like that. But now it's only 1/3, but it is going to become over half pretty soon. So on the first one, yeah, it's true that the budget keeps on poverty gets higher each year, but it's still very low. So
very low.
Think about it in this sense.
Half. Actually, it's half. I mean, if you look comparing it 2011 versus 2012, the number of poor people is actually being elevated, 1 million, around 1 million, but in 2012, 2,500,000.
No, actually, look, I'll come to it because you've sort of got two parts to the question. One is the budget is going up, the other is poverty is not going down as fast as it used to. And both of those are true, but I want to put them in context. And the first is, it depends what we mean by the budget for poverty and what things we're including in that 100 trillion. If we look at all those programs on social assistance that I was talking about, Jam Kesmas, Raskin, PKH, BSM, for example, there hasn't been a BLT for a number of years. The total annual spending is probably less than 30 trillion. So, probably less than that. So of that 100 trillion, most of it isn't going directly to poor households, right? I don't know what else is in there because I don't know who's adding those numbers together, but it could include, for example, BOSS, money going to schools, which will benefit both poor children and non-poor children. Probably more likely what it includes might be PAM, the Community Empowerment Program. And PAM is a great program, but PAM gives block grants to communities so that they can put in the things they need, like schools and hospitals or roads or so forth. That doesn't necessarily mean it reaches the poor households. It's more designed to empower and develop communities. So the amount that's actually been going directly to poor households is quite low, less than 30 trillion, as I said. But even if I include a BLT there, where it might be more like 40 trillion or something, as a percent of GDP, the amount spent on direct assistance to poor households is 0.5%. So half of 1% of GDP is spent on social assistance programs for the poor. To give you a benchmark of where that sits for the world, the average in Asia is 1%, so twice as high.
Was it increasing?
That number, it's certainly increased since before the crisis and since just after the crisis. There didn't used to be any host.
The ratio, like not the nominal amount.
No, the ratio has definitely been increasing because there was very little until after the crisis when a lot of these programs started. But in Asia it's 1%, and in the developing world it's 1.5%. So it is true that the budget's going up, and it is true that we're spending more money on poverty reduction. But not all of that money is going to households. Some of it's directed to communities, and it's still quite a low amount. The second thing I want to talk about, and this is sort of in relation to poverty reduction falling. I don't have a slide here, but there's one that's particularly good. If we're to look at poverty reduction, so if we look at poverty reduction over the last 10 years, apart from 2006 when it went up because of the really high food prices and also rice prices, but also fuel prices at the time, poverty's fallen every year for the last 10 years. But the fall from 2011 to 2012, which isn't on here, is the slowest fall in that period. And if you look at how much it's been falling each year, it's been slowing for the last 4 years or so. It's been going down, but been going down by less. So you're absolutely right that the rate of poverty reduction is falling. Now, what are the reasons? There's a few reasons for it. One of it is something I talked about at the start, which is as your poverty gets lower and lower, the remaining poor are even further below the line than the people who have just come out of poverty are. So for the same amount of income growth, you're going to get fewer people come above the line because the people who are remaining are further below. It's not the only reason, but one of the reasons is it gets harder to deal with poverty as you get lower poverty rates, because not only is their income much lower, but these are the people who are the most marginalized, right?
Isn't that make them more easy to target, isn't it? If you hardcore poor, then in terms of targeting,